Hello, strangers. I hope you're doing well out there. As it is Tuesday, and as it is custom, I have another true scary story for you. And this one is number 81. This isn't my story. It's one of my uncle's. My uncle is in law enforcement. He has a lot of random stories he'll share when he's in the right mood. At a family event like a barbecue, when he thinks the kids are all asleep or distracted, then and only then, his stories will lose their PG rating quick. It's like a quinceañera or a bar mitzvah in my family, this rite of passage when my uncle looks at you and then doesn't insist that you go find something else to do while the adults are talking. For context, he works in Columbus, Ohio. You're probably going to need that for some of the things he talks about. And for reference, the night he told us this was a hot summer night. The air was so muggy, it felt like it was physically resting on your face. He started this story by saying he could never explain some of the things he'd seen on the job. After the usual jokes about how drugs were a hell of a drugs, he kind of intimated that this story, that whatever he was about to tell us, it was different in some marked way. And this is the story he told. I was on graveyard shift. My day began and ended in a thin slice of sunlight. The bulk of when I was on duty was night. I got used to the dark and the stillness of it. I was walking a beat then, working patrol. I don't do that much anymore, but back then my job was driving through neighborhoods when not answering calls. On the night in question, the call I got was at 10:31. A 10:31 isn't a drop everything and roll kind of call. It's a keep an eye out for a missing person. The call was accompanied by a description of a vehicle, silver, US make and model, mid-size sedan, and the person themselves, male, white, mid-30s, brown hair and eyes. Per the call, the man was on his way to North Carolina, but as they were alerted about an hour into his trip, he'd left his phone. He was thus making use of payphones and gas station phones as he stopped for gas along his route. He'd fallen silent, however, on his drive, and the family couldn't get a hold of him. Hence, they'd called it in, and hence yours truly getting a 10:31. Now, with those details, you might as well have sent out a bolo for blue sky or green grass. Essentially, the police were tasked with finding the most generic-sounding man in the world driving the most generic car ever made. But it was somebody's family member, so I took an especially close look at all the silver mid-size sedans that I passed. I probably pissed off a lot of drivers that night, but maybe me not noticing they were speeding or whatever made up for it. Priorities, you know. Somebody was missing, and maybe I had a chance of catching him. I didn't have a lot of hope, but imagine my surprise when about an hour into my shift, I spotted a silver, mid-size sedan at the side of the road. I typed in the plate, and what do you know? It's a match. As I pulled in behind him, I saw the silhouette of a man's head moving in the driver's seat. I don't mind saying I was delighted to have located the missing man as well as the missing car. It looked like he was well enough to move. All too often, calls like this don't end with finding a 10:31. Well, not with a body temperature above room, if you get my drift. I hit the light bar and whooped my siren to give the motorist a heads up. Every time you stop, you have to call in something, so I called in a 1046, which is a stranded motorist. I got out of the car and made my way over. The person in the driver's seat was idling, moving, but not in a purposeful or obvious way, just breathing, watching me in his rearview mirror. I came to a stop just behind his driver's side door. You have to do that. There was another officer who stood directly in front of the door on a stop once. The motorist she'd pulled over turned out to have a loaded shotgun resting on his lap. She got a hip full of buckshot for her trouble that night. I like my hips just the way they are, so I stayed back behind the door. Plus, it makes the driver have to turn a little awkwardly to their 8 o'clock to see you. It's a lot less likely for them to attack you without seeing it coming. And he did. The driver turned his head at that awkward angle to look and speak with me. I asked him first if he was okay, and he said, "Yes, sir." He just had a phone call and he needed to pull over. I asked if his name was on the 1031. Let's say it was John Smith. And again, the driver told me yes. He was the man the call was about. I could hardly believe my good luck. I asked for ID, which I confirmed against the man's pale face made white in the bright light of my flashlight. He may have had generic features in the radio description, but in person, both motorist and motorist ID gave more distinction. He had a small, almost feminine nose, and a chin with a cleft in it. As kids, we'd call that chin like that a butt chin, due to the resemblance. But his eyes looked a little, saran-wrapped. If I'm being honest, he looked like he'd had some plastic surgery. I remember that the most, that his face looked a little too tight, a little shiny at the temples. Either way, I was well pleased to have some good news for the night, but not so pleased that I didn't miss something off. See, the man had said he'd pulled over to make a call, and from where I stood I could see he did indeed have a smartphone, docked in one of those holders people buy that clip onto your air vents or something. In the 1031, the man's family reported him missing and said he didn't have his phone with him. I mentioned this to the guy, offering that it had been a woman who'd placed the call, assuming maybe a wife or a girlfriend from what I'd heard. I swear, the moment I mentioned that, his face flashed something like surprise or fear. Then he clamped a lid on it, looking blank-faced again, and told me he just needed a breather, lowering his voice a bit like he was letting me in on the secret. He told me he'd had a tiff with his family and had taken a drive to cool down. The phone call he'd pulled over to make was to a friend to talk it through. I didn't know what to make of this at first. This didn't match what the 1031 had to say about him traveling from Columbus to North Carolina, but I played along. I told him I could understand, and heck, it happened to me too. Every man needs a walkabout sometimes when his blood gets high. I handed him back his ID. I wished him a good night. Then I asked if he wanted an escort back. This time his response wasn't easy or blank, it was abrupt. He said no. It was very different in tone. I let my surprise flash across my face, letting him know his mask had slipped. At this, he gave a breathy chuckle and said, "No thank you," that he was still sorting through his thoughts about the fight. I said I'd let his family know not to worry at the very least, but assured him I wouldn't say where he was. He was an adult. Adults have the right to take a walk without a nanny, you know. I told him good night. He said the same, and I walked back to my car and got in. But I didn't pull out my radio and call in. Something about this whole thing felt weird. That flash when I'd mentioned the family, the woman looking for him. It was fear. Why would he be afraid? Maybe that's why I got back out of the car and walked back to the man. He was still sat there, but he hadn't taken his eyes off of me. I pulled out one of the cards they give us with our name, number, and badge on it and gave it to him. I told him if he needed anything, if things were worse at home than he wanted to let on, that he could give me a call. He was jumpy, but when I handed him the card, he gave me a cautious smile and said thanks again. And at this point, that was it. That's all I had. I'd literally played my only card. I didn't have any other questions, anything but this strange feeling that I was looking at the surface of something and missing what was actually happening underneath. What could I do but get back into my car, pull out, and go? I was so rattled that I was almost at the station when I finally called in to call off the 1031, amending it to a 1031 Adam. Missing person found. Dispatch confirmed, and I tried to put it out of my head as I returned to my car, noting my mileage and gas on the log and coming back into the station. The dispatcher, a lovely and talented woman you have all had the pleasure of meeting, my wife, waved at me. We weren't married at the time, that's how long ago it was, but there was something there. She waved me over and asked to hear about the 1031. She called the family back, and like me with Mr. Smith on the side of the road, she too thought something was off. See, when she'd called the family to let them know he was found and not to worry, the same woman who'd called in the report answered. She'd expected them to sound happy that he'd been found safe and sound, and the woman on the phone was, a bit. But when she started asking about where the man had been found, like the specific location in which, quote, he'd been hiding, she'd laughed, but something in her voice wasn't happy. Dispatcher had expected relief from a worried family member that the man was found okay. I expected to feel like the matter was solved. Neither of us got what we expected. There was something off about the man, and something off about his family that had called it in. The dispatcher, Susan, added that she thought the woman on the phone picked up on how strange she must have sounded. She added this qualifying chuckle and then said, quote, well, you know, the kids are worried. All she could respond back to the woman on the phone was, hey, understood. When the reporting officer comes in, I'll see if there's additional detail. And hence, she asked me when I came in. But when she brought up the lady and quoted her, the kids are worried, not my kids or my second cousin's kids. It just, again, sounded weird. When you hear one half of a couple refer to the kids, the insinuation is that they're shared kids, the man and the woman's. That was how I read it anyway. So I think it over. I saw the man, close enough to get detail, close enough to think he'd had some botched plastic surgery. The hand he'd had all death gripped on the steering wheel when I walked up had no wedding ring. But hey, some men don't wear a ring. But then, kids. There was a lack of kid tracks in the man's car. There were no toys. There were no lost French fries. There were no jammy sets of fingerprints on the back window. It could have been that the man was particular about his vehicle. Maybe he kept it clean so the kid evidence couldn't accumulate. But then when he'd mentioned the tiff with his family, he didn't mention which family member. Wouldn't you expect if the man had a wife or a girlfriend or a surly teenage kid that he'd say, well, that? How often do people just say family when they mean one specific person? But then again, that could just be some self-centered unawareness. And then, of course, there was the family insisting he didn't have a phone when he clearly did. End of the day, it was a lot of circumstantial, but inconsistencies like that, so many of them, it just felt off. It bothered me like fleas. But what could I do about it? I'd technically solved the mystery. I found the missing man. I checked on him. I walked back and gave him a card. I did everything I could do. And the dispatcher had called the family. All that could be done had been done. So I wrote my report. I shoved the unease down. I clocked out and I went home. If there was more to come, so be it. And with a bit of resignation, I assumed nothing more would come. But it did, chauffeured directly to me in another patrol car. I guess after I found the man, made my report, and the family had been contacted, he didn't turn up quick enough for that lady's liking. She'd called in another report of him still missing. All the active patrols went back on the lookout for the same silver sedan I'd confirmed wasn't missing. And I guess some private security cop that worked the mall was listening, because he called in the same silver sedan parked in their parking structure. It was a big store, often full enough that one silver sedan parked in it could go unnoticed, at least until the store closed and 9 p.m. left it standing alone, obvious like the last wallflower at the school dance. The car was empty. The car was unlocked. The car had a trunk. The driver of the car was reported missing. Squatty did the math and exigent circumstances, which means permission to act swiftly when it is possible that action would void danger or threat to life, was what he came up with. His partner popped the trunk. The trunk was as empty as the car. Now, this wasn't an obvious crime scene, but it was abandoned, and with an active 1031, it could be one. Close enough. Now, I was hearing about all of this at home. That off taste I'd had about the 1031 the night before was all coming back. I had to chew on that until I came in the next night for my shift. That gave them time to tow the car and get the crime lab involved. So when I came in, I made a point to stop by the lab. I'm glad I did. The technicians found my card in the glove box, so they'd been meaning to call me in anyway. I started to walk them through the interaction, but I only got so far until the tech stopped me. He stopped me by showing me my card, and then flipping it over to show me the back. Something was written on it, in small, cramped ballpoint pen. I'm not married. They're not my family. When I tell you my gut went to water, I felt cold, but it felt right. It answered everything that had felt so off about the whole thing. But where'd he go then? And why was some group pretending to be his family, trying to locate him? If John Smith was not married, and the missing person call was not placed by worried family, well, who the hell were they? I asked to see the missing persons report. I wanted to call Mrs. Smith back. Imagine my lack of surprise that I found the number had been disconnected. I took my patrol car down to the suburb listed as a living address on the man's insurance slip that night. The house looked dark, as empty as his car had been. Wasn't until the next day they got the go-ahead to check out his house. Exigent circumstances again. I read the report. It was messy, but single-man messy. There were 2 empty red-striped beer bottles on the kitchen counter. There was one queen bed with sheets that looked frayed. There were no decorations, no animal cookie crumbs or kid-drawn finger paints. No toys. Not a stray bobby pin or drawer with the things a woman keeps in the bathroom. The house gave us nothing but a confirmation of what John had written on the back of my business card. He didn't have a family. When they pulled records, it only confirmed John Smith's story and discredited the worried family entirely. There were no marriages, no birth certificates with Mr. Smith listed as a father. And that was it. We had nothing left to chase, just a modern-day disappearing man story, which I'm sure happens every day, and honestly, that's not the part that bothers me. The part that bothers me is the people chasing him, people willing to get law enforcement involved to chase him down or to flush him out of hiding. I'll tell you right now, to this day, we don't know for sure, but enough time has passed and enough details glossed over that hell, I'll tell you my theory, all based on one more fact. We had that car impounded, the silver sedan that I met John Smith in that night. Now, the government of the United States of America may have, in the past, been read to filth for their financial peccadillos. You know, the $500 toilet seats and all that. But I've found that people I've met on the federal side are a lot more frugal than you know. The feds may have had a ton of cash to spend on fancy blue windbreakers, but some silver sedan looking like it had been bought used from a rental fleet, well, that's a solid asset. And apparently, one that they were unwilling to write off. I say this because after we had the car impounded, a week or so later, a federal agent popped up in person wanting to pick up the car. My gut says this could all just be a chain of random events and coincidences and misunderstandings. Or it could be that the man in question was evading something or someone, and Witsec was helping him do it. We may never really know, but deep down, I think you can guess what I think. Well, would you look at that? We've stumbled upon one of those random twofers. Lucky you. You found another hidden story. When we served, there was this guy that went blue to green, Air Force to Army. Many congratulations on him for deciding to leave behind the Cub Scouts. Apparently he'd worked SecFo, security forces. The recruiter had made it sound like he was going to be on SWAT. Instead, he guarded a gate in the middle of Oklahoma. One night, he guarded a gate with two others. The gate closed at 1800, so at 1800 they popped the barriers and dragged the chain link across. But they still had to sit there and watch it. A manned gate is a manned gate. They were in the shack watching stuff on their phones when a pair of lights flashing caught their eyes. They looked out and saw it was headlights, wavering erratically. The road that led up to their guard shack was straight and narrow. If the guy was swerving, it wasn't the fault of the road. Oh boy, my buddy remembered saying, as they all got up and walked around the chain link fence, ready to talk to the guy. At that point, he figured lost motorist, distracted maybe, or a drunk driver. When the guy pulled up, though, he didn't look drunk. He looked wide awake, like he'd been wide awake for 2 weeks. My buddy described him as a dandelion made into a person, skinny, wiry, his hair suffering from static. My buddy approaches and asks him, "Hey, I don't know if you know this, sir, but this isn't a public access road. Are you lost?" And the guy starts rambling off about how he's late trying to get to the other side of town, how he thought this would be a shortcut, how, of course, officer. He kept calling them officers. Of course, he couldn't come through there. He'd take his leave. Meanwhile, my buddy's two friends are sort of pacing around the vehicle. What happened next might have been one of them being extremely thorough. It might have been one of them seeing the telltale signs of drug use and thinking, Can't let this guy drive around like this. Or it could have just been the boredom of sitting in an empty shack watching a shut-down gate for 12 hours. For whatever reason, he decided to try it. Hey, sir, maybe you could help us out. We, need to stop and check so many cars every hour or we get in trouble. Now, this was an obvious lie. How would you have a vehicle inspection quota on a gate that was tucked in for the night? But at this, the driver started to hee-haw a donkey laugh and said, "Oh, sure, of course, nothing to hide. What's mine is yours." And with that, he popped the trunk. My buddy escorted the man out of the car as his two friends circled around to the trunk. Now, the guy was by himself, and when he got out of the car and checked for weapons, it was obvious that he could be taken in a fight. But there was something so jeering, this sort of, "Joffrey, I've got a good joke on you." Maybe that's why my buddy walked the guy away from the car. He told me outright he thought that there might be something explosive in the car, and his only thought was to get the guy away from it so he couldn't detonate it. His willingness to pop the trunk put aside any fears that the man was driving around a trunk full of body parts. But then again, the guy appeared to be wired out of his gourd. Maybe, just maybe, when they cracked open that trunk, they might find something looking back at them. And the way my buddy tells it, what was in that trunk was a shock. It was stuffed full, almost to the point of spilling over, of things in every color, every size, some appearing floppy, some appearing rigid. Some of them even looked like glitter had been mixed in with their polymer or vinyl or latex, whatever those things are made out of. That trunk was chock full of, marital aids. The kind that resemble a Hillshire Farm summer sausage sampler. My buddy passed off the dandelion man to one of the others and walked around to get a closer look. The same guy who had suggested the vehicle inspection in the first place looked at my friend and said, "What do you make of that?" My buddy said, "Something I'm going to close this lid on." But his friend stopped him. "You mean we're not going to search them?" My buddy's lip curled when he told this part. I told him, God, no. Not with all the gloves in the world. But his friend was already gloving up. "Well, I'm going to search him." He was told he could go right ahead. And while my buddy looked on, his friend seized one. A large purple ticket, if you can picture it. At this, the dandelion man, who had been chuckling and flapping his gums, suddenly started to alert. No, that's enough. You had your look, that's enough." But my buddy's friend was already turning it over and prizing open the battery compartment. And what do you think fell out of the battery compartment of that marital aid? Not batteries. A tiny, tightly wound baggie full of what looked like the dust of crushed yellow glass. The watch commander was called, and more base police were issued forth. I can only imagine the jokes that went on in that evidence locker as they logged in each marital aid, of which there ended up being somewhere in the vicinity of 79. I know, 10 less and it would have been a real memeable moment. All told, pounds of the stuff, you guessed it, Florida's finest, were locked up, and the guy in question arrested. He was a mule, but also an ardent fan of the stuff, and as he'd been following some random tom-tom variant from the 1990s, He had no idea of which roads were not public access, as he tried to drive his delivery route. To this day, my buddy still laughs when he tells that story. But even he has to admit that of all of them, his friend was the better cop. Because, as he looks me dead in the eye, he tells me, I mean, even if it happened again today, I still don't think I'd touch him. And I have to admit, just like there are some times a man is permitted to cry without being shamed, this falls squarely into one of those times a man can be scared to touch something. You don't know where those have been. And if that's not a horror story, I don't know what could be. Thanks for listening, strangers. Like, comment, subscribe. All, none, a mix. It's entirely up to you. I'm just grateful to you for stopping by. Until next time, take care, strangers.